Welcome to the inaugural episode of Frigg'n Heathens Podcast. This first episode is to give you a little bit of information on who we are, why we're doing what we're doing, and why it's relevant. Just a heads up, swearing will happen because we're adults and we can do that, so be forewarned. You might be asking why make a podcast? There's already a bunch of stuff out there, and there are some really excellent podcasts on heathen content for sure. So many of them are aimed at absolute beginners though. There's nothing wrong with that, but there's a notable lack of information about how to find and really use sources for heathen reconstruction. So we're trying to fill a weird niche that will hopefully appeal to both beginners and veteran practitioners of various heathen spiritualities. A lot of access to some of these sources is prohibitive too, because either they're behind a paywall, or they're out of print, or they're just hard to find, and a lot of them are really just hard to read in general. So we're going to hopefully make some of those things a little more accessible too. So a little bit about who we are. So Moxi, you want to start?
Yeah, I'm Moxi. My pronouns are she, her, and they, them, kind of depending on the day. Take your pick. It really doesn't offend me either way. I've been a pagan for a little over a decade now, close to 2 years as a heathen. I'm a reconstructionist and revivalist sort of mix. I am the founder and director of the Heathenry Indexing Project, which is an ongoing project to index as many sources as possible, both ancient sources and modern ones, like books and podcasts and YouTube channels that have some really useful information and can be important to researching heathenry as a religion, both its history and the modern day practice. And it'll be indexed into a searchable database. So for example, with oaths, so you're wanting to learn about oaths. So you would go to the indexing website and you would type in the search bar oaths, and that would bring up everything we had indexed thus far about oaths that mentioned oaths or that referenced them. And you would be able to then see where that reference was and then go find that source and read about it.
It's so cool. I love it so much.
I'm really excited about it. We're currently building out the technology aspects of it, kind of all the back end and getting things set up. And we're indexing sample text in kind of a makeshift way right now that will be migrated to the database. It is a long-term project, and by that I mean it will never be complete because there are always more sources. It's a project that I believe in very strongly. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's super cool. I'm really excited for when we can actually roll it out.
Yeah, that's probably going to be a little while to have enough index to do that, but it's coming along.
And I'm Astrid. I use she, her pronouns. I have been pagan for about 20 years, heathen for about 12. I'm also mostly a reconstructionist, but there's definitely kind of a lot of wiggle room in my personal practice. I kind of do a little bit of everything in some areas, but I generally stick to reconstruction. I have a bachelor's degree in history focused on medieval Europe and a master's degree in library and information science. And I'm currently working in a local library system, so I'm a huge nerd. Anything history related, I'm all for it. Anything book related, need to find some weird fucking book you read in middle school that you can't remember the name of, but you remember a little bit about the plot and what was on the cover. DM me and I will find it for you in 15 minutes. That's my superpower.
I have seen that happen before. It's pretty amazing, actually.
It's my superpower, damn it.
So there's lots of stuff online about what resources are good to use. You can find reading lists and recommendations and all kinds of stuff like that. But there's not really a lot about how to evaluate the resources you find, especially for heathen reconstructionists, like when you're looking at it from a religious perspective. There are a lot of different things to consider.
There's a ton of stuff out there, especially in the age of the internet. You can put anything on a blog or a YouTube channel and claim it as fact, and no one can tell you otherwise, except for, obviously people can.
But people who are new to the faith, finding that, really don't know how to weigh that information.
No, not at all. And that's normal. People, especially because I think all previous generations, up to a couple of the past ones, anytime anything was put in print, it was assumed that it was vetted to some degree, because it was everything was either printed in a book or a newspaper or a journal or something like that. So there was always some vetting there. The internet took that out of the equation. You can put whatever you want online.
Yeah, you can.
So trying to be responsible about what you put on the internet, kids. It's important. Our name Frigg'n Heathens has a little bit of a fun story to it. If you haven't caught on yet, you will eventually. For people who know us, Moxi and I are both kind of snarky, and but there's a little more to that, and Moxi can go into that real quick.
So we are both heathens, hence the heathen part, and we do both include Frigg in our hearth cults. In the Locusena, it was said of Frigg, and this is from the Bellows translation of the Poetic Edda, it was said, "The fate of all does Frigg know well, though herself she says it not." And I see Frigg as, seeing the fates of everyone but saying nothing. And that vibes with me from a recon's perspective, because the gods know all the things we'll never know about how they were worshipped in the past. And based on this passage, the fate of what is yet to come for all of us. Mm-hmm. But they're not going to write us a book about it. We just kind of have to take the knowledge available to us from the historical sources and figure how to make that work for us today.
Yep. It's a pain in the ass. But it's also kind of a good thing.
It is. But, it does give you some way to figure out how it works in the modern day. It's not saying that we have no feedback on what works and what doesn't, because, we can, UPG and SPG are a thing. We do have experiences with the gods that inform our practice. But as recons, we're still kind of cobbling a religious practice together out of scraps and remnants, and then kind of just fucking around and finding out for the rest of it.
Yeah.
So that's really hard to do unless you know how to utilize the sources that we do have.
Absolutely. And I love that heathenry and a lot of modern pagan reconstruction religions are fucking around and finding out is the best descriptor for that.
Yeah.
Because it's accurate as hell. I love it.
Yeah.
So why is it important to evaluate sources in heathenry? There's a lot of crap out there. If you haven't caught on, you need to pay attention.
There's a lot of it.
There's a ton of it.
There's also a lot of biased sources with skewed perspectives. And this goes to focused sources, but also some that are, biased in other ways, like they're coming at it with a personal agenda or something like that. So that's a thing to be aware of.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of unlabeled UPG, which is unverified personal gnosis. You'll hear us say that fairly often throughout the podcast. It's basically writing your personal experiences as fact and not delineating between your personal experience and fact, or something that is historically attested.
And UPG isn't bad, but when you're going to do that, you've got to tell people that's what you're doing, because it's not like the truth, as much as a truth can be known. This is just something that your experience has brought to you, and it may not ring true for everybody. So that needs to be clearly labeled.
Yes, just so that people don't end up trying to hunt down why you associate Freya with ladybugs.
Yes.
Thinking that it's something that was in a book somewhere or in lore somewhere or in a poem somewhere. When it's just your personal experience, and that's totally valid. It's just tell people that it's your personal experience.
It's the important thing.
One of my favorite things that I learned in my graduate studies for library sciences was the CRAAP test, and part of it is the name. I love the name. It's fun to say. CRAAP test, crap. You can't say poop enough. It's fun. Yeah, because I'm a grown-up.
We're both grown-ups here. Very grown up.
It's great. Poop jokes are still funny. I don't care. But the CRAAP test is a method used to evaluate sources, and we'll come back to this in a little bit. Some small examples for each thing, because it's an acronym. It's really great for evaluating sources, and we'll use it throughout many episodes, I'm sure.
Yeah. This is going to be something important. So this is what we wanted to start out with.
We've also got, I'm going to be a history nerd here and talk about primary, secondary, and tertiary sources, because I don't get to talk about this stuff very often, and it's my podcast too.
So go off.
Primary sources are generally firsthand personal accounts without commentary, like diaries, witness statements, or letters. The Eddas technically count as primary sources, despite not having the original versions of whatever those stories were, because there was probably more than one version, just because we know that Snorri, or whoever it was, wrote it down, and that's the oldest version we have available of those stories. So, considered a primary source. Secondary sources are generally something that comments or interprets primary sources. Most history and textbooks will fall under this category. A lot of really great YouTube channels fall under this as well. Tertiary sources are generally sources that compile or index other sources, like encyclopedias, databases, some textbooks. The Heathen Indexing Project is actually a tertiary source. When it gets off the ground, it's going to be fucking great.
Yeah, will be a
oh my
tertiary
god.
source.
Yes, it's going to be so good. Oh, can you imagine how great that's going to be? It's going to be so great. The Icelandic Saga database is also another good tertiary source.
Yeah, they're really great. So another way to evaluate sources, and when you're looking at them, are the indexes and the works cited. Like, what did the author use for their resources, and did they represent the work properly? This is important. Like double checking citations and making sure that the link the citation they're linking to actually says the thing they say it says. I have seen this before in books where they'll link to something, and when you go to double check, it really doesn't match up with what they're saying.
Oh yeah.
So
yeah.
But also the indexes and works cited, when they actually are lining up with what you're actually looking for, can be a great place to start for your own research. So you can look at, the sources they used and go back even just a step further, in the tertiary, secondary, primary. You get closer to the source and see what material they used to come to the conclusions they did.
And in the process, add more things to your already infinitely long to be read list.
Oh, I have so many things on that list.
I know, it's a problem. I think all of us do. Like, it's a truly unique reconstructionist problem. There is no ending to the amount of reading, which is good, but also,
it can be frustrating.
Yeah. And speaking of frustrating, misinformation in the internet is a thing. So citations and references, do they have any of that stuff on that website? Do they put their name on it? Is there an author or an organization or institution responsible for the website? What does that sponsor or institution support, or what's their mission? Check for those biases, because that was so important in kind of filtering out the information that you find on the internet. Same with YouTube, same deal. Do they cite their sources? Do they even have sources? And if they don't, do they tell you up front, this is my own personal interpretation of things, or my own UPG? Like, do they say those things outright? Because if they don't, take it with a grain of salt.
YouTube is a great resource. There are a lot of good YouTubers out there. But there again, you have to ask, do they cite? Do they have sources? And it's really good if you can look. A lot of them will put in their description, their citations and sources. So that's a way to kind of double check the validity when you can actually go to those sources. Once again, sources. And
sources.
And
we're going to say that a lot.
We're going to say
sources.
that a lot.
Make it a drinking game. How many times we say sources in this episode?
Yes. Yeah, so you can go back and see that and see, once again, whether it lines up with what they're saying, or if you come to a different conclusion after reading it, because there is room for interpretation when you read these sources. Yes.
Do you want to start with some of the heathen-specific problems? Because, oh my god, there's a laundry list of them.
Yeah. So one of the things you have to concern is the author a Nazi? Are they a folkist? Is the publisher, web host, sponsor, folkish, or white supremacist? And is there a difference between Nazis and folkists?
Yeah. I mean, I hate that this is a problem that we have to focus on, but it is, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would fall on the side of there are plenty of folkists who are not Nazis.
Yeah, but there are.
It comes down to, though, they're basing their practice on the ideas that were started by Nazis, where it was intended to be a unifying force for a race or an identity, a national culture. And so it becomes very exclusionary, and it is interpreted very, it's very biased in that respect.
Yeah, because they're pushing an agenda, really. Like, they're pushing this idea of a mythic past for the white race, which is garbage.
Exactly.
And yeah, unfortunately, that is something that you'll have to pay attention to when you look at heathen sources, or you're looking at any sources through a heathen lens. Is the author a literal Nazi, or do they just seem Nazi-esque?
An example would be, there are some problematic YouTube channels. We can talk about Survive the Jive. Actually has Nazi-made rune symbol, the winged Othala, as a tattoo on his chest.
Lovely.
Yeah, so That's a thing.
Love it here.
There are places to watch out for. Also, you'll run into Stephen Flowers or Edward Thorson. They're same dude, different name. Wrote about runes a lot and gets cited a lot, but a lot of that stuff is UPG, and he's very close ties with the Asatru Folk Assembly and Stephen McNallen, who are problematic figures. And if you want to know more about that, Ocean Keltoi has a good Omnipotent Beard episode on his channel called Heathenry in America. And they go over a lot of the associations and kind of how all those things came to be at the beginning of heathenry in America. So that's a good resource to check out when you want to know kind of where a lot of those organizations come from.
Yeah. One of the really good things you can do to sort of just help figure out what filter you need to look at and what lens you need to look at some of these sources through is how old the source is. What's the historical context or time period that source came from? Was it from the Victorian era? Was it from the Romantic era? Is it modern? Is it from Roman Empire? Like, when was it from? Because there are certain biases and certain things that happened in the context of history that are important to understanding why those things were written down at all.
So particularly like Victorian Romantic era, there was a lot of, romanticization of Germanic and Norse folklore. And a lot of stuff that was written was just kind of without foundation. They just kind of made it up. I have a really good example. I went into this big rabbit hole. I saw an illustration by John Charles Dolman of Frigga spinning the clouds. And
love it.
It was a beautiful, beautiful illustration, and I love the imagery.
So great.
It is, and I wondered, she's associated with fiber arts, and so I get that, but the clouds, I'm like, does that come from somewhere? Am I missing something? So I go on this big long search looking for sources, and the illustration came from a book by H.A. Gerber. I don't know if that's how you pronounce her last name. It's Guerber. That book was published in 1909. And after trying to track down things, because of course there were no citations given at all.
Why would there be? Of course not. Citation? Son of a bitch. It's a curse. I swear.
So
curse.
I had several people help me look for sources, and I bought a couple books that said they referenced it, and everything referenced back to this one book by Gerber. It's Myths of the Norsemen from the Eddas and the Sagas. And it seems, from what I have managed to find thus far, that it was just made up whole cloth. The quote from that book is, although she often appeared beside her husband, Frigga preferred to remain in her own palace called Finselir, the Hall of Mists or the Sea, where she diligently plied her wheel or distaff, spinning golden thread or weaving long webs of bright-colored clouds. It's beautiful imagery. It is absolutely gorgeous. I can find no historical foundation for that whatsoever.
It doesn't mean you can't use it in your practice now, though. If that's what you associate her with, that's fine.
You absolutely can. It's just being aware of where this comes from. This would be modern UPG. This would not be a historically backed reality of how things were represented in the past.
Yes, it's a whole thing.
It is.
It's a whole thing, and it sucks. I mean, and like, especially things from the Romantic era and just prior to that, especially in Germany, like, okay, I'm going to nerd out again. The Grimm brothers.
Go for it.
Wrote their the Grimm's fairy tales during a time when German nationalism was just starting to become a thing. They were trying to create this mythology that was explicitly and inherently German. Like, they wanted to preserve the essence of the Germanic peoples. And it's a whole thing. So they went through the countryside preserving all of these folk and fairy tales, trying to preserve German heritage in a time of immigration and political upheaval. And without their fairy tales, we would have it would be a shame. But
yeah, there's so much that's good there, but
yeah.
There's also going to be a lot of bias.
Yes, like, you have to realize that's what the point was. The point was to preserve a specifically Germanic heritage. And so a lot of times sources that come from that time period especially when they were starting to get really excited about Norse mythology again, was super biased in this whole, the Germanic people are these noble savages who are being controlled and watered down, and it's just shit.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
Yeah. So keep that in mind when you look at stuff. Oh, it sucks that we have to do that, but we do.
It is a constant struggle.
Mm-hmm. So scholarly sources are another really good one. Scholarly meaning published in an academic journal, generally reviewed by peers in the same field, all that good stuff. Self-published stuff is also a good source. Doesn't always matter if it's self-published. Sometimes it does, but it's kind of just another thing to pay attention to. A lot of it can be really well researched, really good sources in it, and supported with evidence. But, again, do a little research on the publisher. See what they do. Unfortunately, I have run into the problem where I'll pick up a book that I think is really cool, like it was only published a couple years ago or something, and I'm like, oh, this is a neat cover, or looks like it has some neat information in it. I'll buy it. Come home, find out 2 days later, because of course that's how the shit works, that the publisher pushes white supremacist rhetoric, and I'm like, can they just put a swastika on their publishing logo and make it easy?
It would make it much more simple.
It would.
It really would.
Come on, guys. It drives me nuts.
I think you'll likely find that a lot of heathenry, like heathen religion specific resources may be self-published. There's not really a journal for that as far as I'm aware.
No. Not that I found yet. We can start one. Let's not start one yet. Let's one project at a time. Oh my god.
Yes.
There are some good scholarly journals out there that you can find with access to databases and other free and open source resources that we're going to get to in a little bit. Because a lot of those things are published in academic journals on Scandinavian and Norse history. Some language journals are really good. Stuff about Old Norse or like Old English kind of stuff. There's always some good juicy bits in there.
Yeah.
Archaeological and technical papers are also really, really good. They can be really hard to get through, especially if you're not used to reading technical papers.
I am not used to reading technical papers, and I still struggle with this. This is a part where I need to work on, because the information can be so dense, and so the terminology is so specific to the field that you kind of have to get an understanding of what it is they're talking about before you can parse what the information itself is.
Yes. And a lot of times, like, just finding someone who is interpreting archaeological evidence that's already been found, like Neil Price is a great author who interprets
absolutely
archaeological evidence. Yeah. Nancy Marie Brown does that a little bit in some of her books on the Viking Age, and a lot of that stuff is great because you can still find access to those archaeological records just through searching on Google. Like, you can find diagrams of grave sites. It's so cool.
It is. We have the problem of having very little written evidence from that time, the Iron Age and Viking Age, because writing wasn't widely practiced. Iron Age in Scandinavia is roughly 500 to 800 CE.
Ish.
And the Viking Age-ish, the Viking Age roughly 792 to 1066 CE, and that number will budge a little bit depending on who you're talking to and what they consider those things.
It's all a little arbitrary.
Wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey.
It's a soup. Time is a weird soup.
It is. And a lot of the surviving sources that we have were written by Christians and Romans. So there again, you're looking through the biases from that lens, because they were looking to kind of suppress those religions. But at the same time, they're writing about their history or their people, and they want to preserve some of that culture, but also they don't want to give a how-to manual on how to do heathen rituals. Mm-hmm. So that's a constant struggle.
Yep. And like, speaking of fun how to do heathen rituals shit, books of law are fantastic ways to figure out exactly what people were doing at the time that the Christians didn't want them to do, because they put a lot of detail into them.
This is what you're not allowed to do. And it's like, thanks, take notes on what
exactly. to do. It's great. It's literally like every rebellious teenager's dream to do exactly what the cops tell them not to do.
It is.
And that's exactly what it's like being a heathen reading a law book.
So there's a lot of good free or open source resources you can look at for heathen related topics, because a lot of these books, like we said, are prohibitively priced or out of print or hard to find. But there are some things that you can find that can be really good sources that are available to you online. That is the joy of the internet. We've talked about some of the problems of it, but there are good things as well. Sacredtexts.com is really good for a variety of religions, but they have preserved things like the Eddas and Tacitus Germania and a lot of other sources like that we would consider as close to primary sources as we have.
Yes.
And you can find those there. Also, Project Gutenberg, that also has their older translations, and there are some questions about, in translations, the older versus newer and the way things are translated and the translator bias, and we'll probably get into that at some point. But it is great just to find any information at all that you can for free. And that is a lot better than having to chase down the newest, best anything. So fairy tales and folk tales would fall under this. Also, the Eddas, Tacitus, Saxo, all of those things are on Project Gutenberg.
Yeah, Project Gutenberg is wonderful, and I will talk about them all day long. They are so good because everything on there has expired copyrights, so it's free forever. Academia.edu is another really good resource that's online, that's open source. It's an online database for sharing academic papers and distributing them for free. There are some paid features like translations of papers into English from a different language, but access itself is 100% free. It's also nonprofit, so that's kind of awesome. I have so many PDFs from there that I really need to read. Lots and lots of papers.
Yeah, too much info, not enough time. Once again, the TBR pile, the to be read pile, truly never ends.
Never ends, ever. Never, ever. But it's a fantastic resource. Make sure you check that out for sure if you're looking for something that's a little niche or kind of weird. That you are having trouble finding anywhere else. There's usually a paper about it.
Yeah, I found a lot of interesting stuff on Academia. It's really good.
And JSTOR is another good database with academic papers and journals and primary sources on there. That's what they focus on. It's a really great place to look for history stuff. There is a paywall, though, for certain features, but their open access sources are still really, really great. You don't need to have a login to get them or to download PDFs that are free. So check that out for sure, too, especially if you're looking for primary sources.
Our next source is libraries.
What?
So
libraries?
Tell us how you really feel about libraries,
Libraries,
Astrid.
They're the worst. You should never go to them, ever. They are not a social good. It hurts just to say it. No, libraries are amazing. If your local one doesn't have a book you want, say you're looking for some weird translation of a thing that you can't find anywhere else, and your library system doesn't have it, your library system will be able to do an interlibrary loan and get it for you from another library system if they can find it. I've done it so many times. It's amazing. Great.
I don't think enough people take advantage of that.
Not at all.
Opportunity.
Especially if you live in a town or a city where there's a lot of universities or colleges. A lot of them will have those books available, and you can get that through an interlibrary loan to your public library if you don't have access to the university library. They're awesome.
It's pretty amazing.
And a lot of libraries also have free access to databases like JSTOR or WorldCat through their public computers inside the building. And those are awesome, again, for finding articles, finding theses and journals that are relevant to your heathen-related research. If you want even more help, find a librarian and ask for some help. Most of us are thrilled to help. I am a librarian, if that hasn't been clear by now. And I think I would literally die if someone came into my library and was like, hey, I need to help finding books on Norse mythology and religion during the Viking Age and earlier. And I would be the happiest dead librarian on the face of the planet, because that is like, that's my dream. Someone please come into the library and ask me about this stuff, because, oh my God, I would die. I would die.
They would be the luckiest.
Also, go get a library card.
Yes, have a library card. That's
yes,
very important.
We are recording in September, which is National New Library card month, people.
Oh, is it?
It is.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
I did, because I'm a librarian. Yep, it's fantastic.
Yes. We'd mentioned the Icelandic Saga database. That's a good place to get free copies of the sagas. And they have them in English. They also have copies of things in other languages. So if you do speak another language and you would like to see it and read it that way, there are various sagas of the Icelandic sagas. They don't have all. I don't know of any source that has every saga. There are so many sagas, but you will find a lot of the commonly talked about sagas on the Icelandic Saga database.
Yes. Another great place to find information is a Discord server called The Hold.
The Hold, yeah. We hang out there a lot, actually.
No.
Yeah.
Neither one of us are moderators.
Well.
Damn it.
Maybe kind of both of us.
Yeah, well, okay.
It's a good place though. It's a really good place for education and community, and it's really centered around those things. When there's an excellent reading list that's available to everyone in the server that lists various and assorted paths in heathenry, that has basic background reading as well as some more specific resources and ways to go. Those books have all been, it does get updated regularly, but the books have been vetted and found a lot of useful information in there. And it's a good place to start. If you don't know where to start and say, I want to buy some books, where do I go? That's a really good place to begin.
Yes.
There's also a lot of knowledgeable members from various traditions. As recording right now, there's over 4,000 members in there. So there's probably someone who has some information about the question you're asking. And there's a place where you can go specifically to ask questions, and people will come in and help you with your research and sources or just basic information like, how do I heathen?
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm doing. There will be people there to help you kind of get your feet under you and give you a feel for how to do that. And it's important to note that it is an inclusive, staunchly anti-focused space, LGBTQ plus friendly, not just friendly, but allies.
Absolutely.
And it's a good place to find and get good help for vetting sources, as well as find community and share resources and all kinds of other good stuff. We do book clubs where we go over different books related to heathenry and polytheism and discuss them and figure out what we can learn and take from that ourselves. So it's a pretty cool place. I highly recommend it.
Same. It's very much in line with our podcast mission of making stuff more accessible to people who don't have advanced degrees in Old Norse literature or history, because it's still important information, especially as a heathen.
It is. And the server was started and run by the YouTubers Ocean Keltoi and Wolf the Red, and they're both all about making things accessible and relatable. Yes. So yeah, it's got a really good mission, and it's worked out really well. Yeah, I think.
And like one of the biggest questions that people get, or that we've gotten fairly often in the Hold, is what do I even search for when I look up this kind of stuff? And that's something else that's important to note, is sometimes you can use the Old Norse word for like a poem in the Poetic Edda to search for. Other times you kind of want to look at like for the English translation of that name. So like the tricking of Gylfi instead of Gylfagetting, or the saga of Burnt Njal instead of Njal Saga. Sometimes different search terms turn up different results. Just depends on what search engine you're using and where you're looking and all that good stuff.
I think it's important to note that Astrid and I are both primarily Norse in our practice, though I know I do pull from other Germanic sources. But if you're looking for other traditions, there are some ways. There's other problems with finding sources and different search terms you might want to use. And I would again recommend the Hold, because we do have a wide variety of practices there, so they would be able to help you probably more from experience than we would be able to here.
Yes.
So
yes, primarily Norse heathen. So I don't know a whole lot about Anglo-Saxon heathenry or continental heathenry or any of that stuff as much. So other people would be helpful.
So let's get into that CRAAP test that you were talking about. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, I love the name. It just makes me happy every time someone says CRAAP test.
It's
great.
Really
I love it.
name.
So the CRAAP test, again, one of my favorite ways to simplify evaluating sources because you can apply it to pretty much any source you find to varying degrees. So CRAAP itself is an acronym, CRAAP. So that stands for currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. It's so useful, like fantastic. And we will put a link to a website page that has all of this information on it that will be so useful if you decide to use it later. So with currency is the first letter, obviously. When was the source written? When was it published? Has there been new information uncovered since it was published? And does the source mention that? Or was it revised? Like, these things are important, especially if you're looking at the intranet. Do they tell you explicitly that something was revised? Or did they just change the information? Can you tell? Was there an updated edition of a book? Like, all of those things are important. In fields other than history or sort of reconstructed religions, this matters a little bit more than for us, because like doctors don't want to use a source that's 40 years old for something with newer research available. But with
that would be a bad idea.
No, it'd be really bad. Like, could you imagine going to a psychologist now and their only source is something from like 1909?
Ugh.
It would be the absolute worst. It would be awful. It doesn't matter as much for us as it does for other fields, but it's still important because it gives you a lot of context about when the source was written and why it was written and who wrote it and all of that good stuff.
For example, with archaeological finds, if it's older, have there been new discoveries that change our understanding or new tech that allow for different interpretations of that find? Like there was, DNA analysis in the 80s and isotope analysis later. There's lots of new information that we're finding about all the time, even about older finds. So it's good to check on that and see if there's kind of updated information on those things.
Definitely. So the next one is relevance. Is the source that you're looking at relevant to what you're looking for? Who's the intended audience? Is it every other person on the planet? Is it just other people in the field? Who is it written for? That tells you a lot about what the author already expects you to know and whether or not it's something going to be useful for you.
Exactly. And a heathen specific issue, is it directed at secular academia or is it directed at individuals practicing the religion? Because there again, that depending on what you're looking for, that may impact how you evaluate and interpret that source.
Absolutely. So authority is our next letter in CRAAP. And this is great. This is super important for heathens to some degree, at least. Does the author have credentials to be writing on the topic? Do they have any authority? Who is the author? Who are they sponsored by? Who publishes their work? All of these things will kind of give you some clues as to whether or not it's going to be a useful resource in your research or not.
Yeah. It's also important to note that just because someone has a degree, has like those fancy letters after their name, it doesn't mean they're an expert in the field in which they are writing.
True.
Because they can be writing on something that's a hobby of theirs, but that's not what they're trained in. They're a psychologist and they've got all these letters after their name, but they're writing about history. So you would weigh that slightly differently maybe, or at least take that into consideration when you're reading it as opposed to someone who had studied this academically.
Yes.
But also someone may have vast amounts of experience in a field, just from their own explorations and study, but they never really attained a degree in it. But you really should check those credentials thoroughly.
Yeah.
Publishing houses can tell you a lot, like university presses versus folkish publishers who, as we said earlier, don't just put swastikas on their books.
It'd be so much easier if they did. Just put a winged Athala in your logo, please. Just make it easier for us next time. Yeah. Just because someone has a degree doesn't mean that they know anything about what they're writing about, especially depending on when they got their degree. It could be 40 years old, or it could be in a completely irrelevant field.
Yeah.
It's still important to note, regardless.
Mm-hmm.
So our next A in CRAAP, because there's 2 A's in this CRAAP.
It's really crappy.
is accuracy. Are any claims that are made in the work supported with evidence? Can you verify that information with outside sources? Does it seem unbiased or free from emotions? Those things are super important when looking for heathen sources, especially if you're looking for stuff for reconstruction. Just because obviously you don't want to read something that's made up and then think it's fact.
Yeah, that's really important. And it's important to note that a claim is not an argument.
Yes.
Arguments need to be supported. So if they're just making a claim and not giving you any sources, not giving you any background information about where they're getting this information from, this ties back to watching out for unlabeled UPG again.
Yes.
There needs to be something to support what they're saying.
That's so good. A claim is not an argument. I love that. That's perfect. I love that so much. I'm going to write that down so that I remember it later because that's amazing. But yeah, I mean, you want to make sure that you're getting accurate information. And on the flip side, you want to make sure you're giving accurate information. So if you are the author, you want to make sure that you're citing some shit and like supporting it with outside sources that aren't other sources that you've written, Edred Thorson. I mean, whatever. Anyway, the last letter in our CRAAP test is P. And P stands for purpose. So what is the source meant to do? Is it meant to educate, entertain, persuade? All of those things? None of those things? Does the author have intentions that are clear and obvious? Do they state them? Is there a cultural, religious, political, or whatever bias at play in the source? All of those things. Pay attention to them because it tells you what the angle is that this author is coming at, if there is one.
And this is something as a heathen reconstructionist you will run into many times, or just researching
Constantly.
Heathenry in general. You don't have to be a reconstructionist, but the vast majority of our sources were written by Christians who had an interest in suppressing or discrediting other religions, or Romans. Like Tacitus was writing with an eye to comment on Roman society by comparison. So there were some political biases at play there. So you kind of have to know where the author's coming from and interpret things that way and see where that may have played into how they represented the things they wrote.
Exactly. And a lot of sources we see as primary sources within like recon is stuff that has a very heavy bias one way or another.
It's interesting here. I mean, important to note here that euhemerization is a thing, which is where they would write about the gods as if they were people. So like you have Saxo writing about Odin was just this weird wizard guy who happened to hang around for 300 to 400 years, but totally not a god. No,
totally not a god.
Totally not a god.
Not a god at all.
Could do weird magic stuff, stayed around for centuries.
Yes. That happens in Snorri's Prose Edda a little bit too, like when he's talking about where the gods came from, like they were...
I think they came from Troy originally.
Yeah, there's some weird shit in the Eddas. Like, I'm so excited to talk about that in the next episode. Holy shit. It's going to be so weird.
Yeah, that's going to be fun.
But then, like, they were just regular people who managed to trick these silly, primitive Scandinavians into thinking they were gods. And it's like, what the hell is this nonsense? Like, it's great. I love it. Like, you need to pay attention to those biases, because if you don't and you read it just like it said,
which is another important point, which I don't know how well it fits into purpose, but avoiding mythic literalism is important, because we don't take everything that's written down as if it actually happened. I don't think that the sky is Ymir's skull. I don't think that the clouds are Ymir's brain. I
well,
don't.
Wait, okay, so like, if you think that the clouds are Ymir's brain, did Frigga spin Ymir's brain? See, like, this is the weird shit that you run into when you run into mythic literalism. And it's just, oh my god, it makes me want to stick a pen in my eye. Like, it's just...
I mean, it's not to say there's not truths that you can pull out of there.
Not at all.
There again, and as much as truth can be known. But it's more about the characters and the nature of the gods and of our religion.
Yes.
So we may get more into mythic literalism in a later episode.
We definitely will, because it's really cool to talk about, and it's really interesting to talk about. You always want to make sure you go back through and question some things. Look for some stuff that might not be in line with stuff you read earlier, or something that contradicts itself within a text. Like, those things are all important to figure out and point out to yourself while you're doing this kind of research.
So the CRAAP source can be applied to all sorts of sources. It's just kind of a wide-ranging thing. It's a good broad way to start looking at it. It's really an excellent way of evaluating sources.
Yes, and like I've kind of said before, like, not all steps in the CRAAP test apply as much in heathenry, just because we're generally interpreting sources written by people who didn't practice the religion as it was during the Viking Age and earlier. Everything was written well after, or everything was written that we have left anyway, was written well after people stopped practicing the religion as a whole, generally speaking.
Yeah.
And currency doesn't matter as much for some stuff. The purpose kind of matters to some degree, but not as much. Like, it sort of just depends on what you're looking at, but it's still a good tool for online sources, especially, like, 100% of the time for online sources. Good stuff to have.
It is, there again, with the currency, it's important to note the time period it's written is relevant. So, examining that still is relevant and still is important. It's just when you're looking at what the closest we have to primary sources are, of course, they're not going to be current. They're
Yes.
ancient sources. So there's a distinction to be made there.
Absolutely. Do you have any final thoughts for this episode?
Please look critically at the sources that you're reading. Don't just take anything you read as if it's fact. Intro books, all the way to scholarly journals, all the way to the Eddas themselves. You have to be able to interpret these things from the lens in which the author is writing them. You have to be able to pick that apart and find what's useful and what is as close to accurate as you can find from that source.
Yes. Agree 100%.
So we will put in the description those links to the free open source sites that we mentioned. You shall have that, and you can reference those and use the CRAAP test as you go through them, and that should hopefully give you a good start on evaluating sources.
And in our next episode, we're going to be going over the Prose Edda, and we're going to do the CRAAP test on the Prose Edda. And it's a doozy. It was originally going to be part of this episode, but after we started doing it, we realized it needed...
There's so much to talk about.
It needed to be its own episode, because it's a lot of information. And we're also going to talk about how to use the Prose Edda for reconstruction purposes, because we're both recons and we're trying to make this information more accessible to everybody else. So make sure that you hit that little like button, or that little subscribe button, or that little follow button, depending on where you're listening to this, so that you make sure that you don't miss out on the next episode. That's going to be us rambling about the Prose Edda and how much we love-hate Snorri Sturluson and love-hate sources.
Thanks for listening, guys. See you next time.
Cite your sources, label your UPG, and always question everything.